Well, thanks, Eric. Much appreciated, and we really enjoy the opportunity to work with you. To the people out there, I'm Jeffrey, and
this is Renate.
We're very happy that you're joining us today. The topic of stress has been dear to our hearts, and the impact of stress on education for quite a long time. I heard Peter Senge once say that schools represent the most complex system of all, so being a good educator is tough at the best of times. Right now, the climate is very difficult for administrators and teachers and parents and others, and we look forward to sharing both some of the research and some of our experience with a view to helping people literally reduce stress in schools. So let me begin by showing you what we're going to be covering in this first of what I hope will be many webinars. We're going to be talking about stress as an unseen saboteur and the impact that stress has on how individuals function and on how groups function. And then we're going to show that good community in and of itself is an antidote to stress. Just by building a good learning community, we create the conditions where people are happier and function more effectively. And then in the time available, we want to look at two specific ways of helping to develop that good community. One is to build a field of listening, and we'll go into the nature of listening in some depth. And the other one is to look at how individual people differ, how different styles differ in the way that they listen and in the way that they respond and react to stress. So let's begin with that issue of stress generally, stress the unseen saboteur.
The optimal conditions, in optimal conditions, human beings can do great things. We have enormous capacity for solving problems and being creative, etc. But excessive stress triggers the survival response, and we go on automatic. When we go on automatic, we lose flexibility and are less effective. So let's begin by understanding something about stress. All stress is not bad, and that's important. In fact, the only people that experience stress are dead.
Who don't experience stress.
Who don't experience stress, who don't experience stress are dead. So Hans Selye, who is the so-called father of stress, called stress the non-specific response of the body to any demand made on it. And what that means in real terms is you're sitting down right now, I hope. And as you're sitting, there are cells on your bottom that are not only in stress, but some of them may be dying. So it means that stress simply is. It's a matter of life. It's a fact of life. But he distinguished between good stress and bad stress. And he called one, the good stress, eustress, from euphoria, and the other distress, which is the kind of stress that is really bad for us. And this distinction has been made by other neuroscientists. So there's Joseph LeDoux called this the good and bad reaction to stress, the low road and the high road. So he distinguished between them and based on what was happening in the brain. So our focus today is going to be on distress, that is, what causes it and what does it do to our minds, emotions, and bodies. And most of all, we'll focus on what we can do to avoid it or turn it into something positive.
And we're going to look at some of the extremes, because we're actually going to look at the sort of stress that triggers the survival response, fight or flight. Because those are the conditions under which research shows quite conclusively that parts of the body begin to shut down. For instance, when people are in survival mode, their digestion is impeded. And so one of the possible reasons why we have an obesity epidemic in our country is the huge amount of stress and the degree of fight or flight that people are experiencing. The bottom line is that when we're in that mode, not only our bodies but parts of our brains shut down. That means literally our intelligence is compromised, to be more colloquial. Collectively, we become more stupid. And that applies to all of us. So let's go and take a look at some of the researchers.
One of my former professors was Arthur W. Combs. And he looked at how we react to stress. And the thing that he pointed out was that when when we are in this negative kind of stress on the low road, he demonstrated that what he called the narrowing of the perceptual field. And what that means, we've all experienced this, but it's a very important point. It means that under stress, that is the result of fear or a sense of helplessness, you lose access to things we ordinarily know very well. We've all had this experience. We suddenly can't recall a word or a phrase, don't remember where we put our keys, focus only on one thing, and lose sight of the larger picture or larger context. So let's look at how researchers are establishing how stress can do this. We're going to show a brief video, and Jeffrey's going to do that.
We're downloading from YouTube. It's about the impact of stress on the memory of mice. So this will take a moment, hopefully only a brief moment before we begin streaming.
Stress at work, stress at home.
So we will take a deep breath.
Home. Now scientists studying mice are discovering all that stress can make us forget things or lead to other mental lapses. Mice are good but reluctant swimmers and can easily remember the location of a subsurface platform. But after hearing a series of stressful sounds, the mice have a harder time remembering. The University of Washington's Jin-Sok Kim has learned how stress affects the brain's ability to process information. He did that by listening to the hippocampus, part of the brain involved in learning and memory.
Think of it as putting a miniature microphone into the hippocampus, and as the animal is navigating, you are listening to the cells.
He found that the same brain cells fired when the mouse identified a location and returned to it. But when the mouse was stressed,
Following stress, the cell that fired in a particular location still fired at the same location, but tend to fire at a different frequency.
as he wrote in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences, Kim also found that stress slowed the brain's ability to connect brain cells that form memories and more.
It's not just memory, but how the memory is used for other higher cognitive functions, such as decision making.
It's research that gives us an idea of what's going on when we are trying to keep our heads above water. I'm Brad Closer.
So I want to say something about the hippocampus. It is really, it's in the center of the brain, and it's critical to learning. It also reads the context. So when the hippocampus is compromised, not only do we not see what there is to be learned or to be understood or to be remembered, we also aren't taking on board any new memories. So this is critical for learning.
So let me give you an example of how the narrowing of the perceptual field might impact you in school. Imagine that you've got an issue in front of you, for instance, how to deal with a community that is becoming concerned with what's going on in the school. They really want results to improve, and there are strong disagreements amongst the staff. They may begin to talk very angrily with each other, and one of the implications when people begin to get distressed, when fight or flight kick in, is that if somebody suddenly begins to change their mind, we may not even notice that. It may turn out that some people are violently agreeing. That is, they think they're disagreeing because they literally cannot hear each other in the conversation. That's the sort of thing that happens when the perceptual field is narrowed.
Another neuroscientist, one of our favorites, is Joseph LeDoux, and he tells us about the same kind of thing. In effect, he's telling us that too much stress actually makes us less effective and, quite frankly, more stupid. And how does this happen? Think of the brain as a hugely interconnected web, like a huge electronic grid. This part of the brain then deals with automatic, fast responses, what is biologically built into us. So this part of the grid is at the back and bottom of the brain. This is what he calls the low road, okay? Now, thinking, planning, synthesizing information, seeing patterns, creativity and thought and reflection happen in the front of the brain, or what's known as the prefrontal cortex. Accessing this part of the brain requires more energy and is slower, even though it's very critical. Under stress, the grid takes care of emergencies first, and that means what we do is instant and only rarely involves thought or imagination. If, however, we are constantly sending energy to these areas, the back and lower part of the brain, the rest of the brain, such as the prefrontal lobes, get less energy. We lose the capacity to access more complex functions, and this is why we become less intelligent.
So let's take a look. LeDoux had a classic example when he described the low road and the high road. He talked about a couple of people who were out in the wilderness, and they came across something that might have been a little bit like a snake. Well, hence the panic sign that you've got on your screen. People who are frightened of the snake and shift into the low road, the survival response, will automatically either freeze or attack it and try and kill it, or run. Whereas people who are interested will say, now I wonder what that is, and move forward, or at least begin to explore it. Now let's think metaphorically about the snakes that occur in education. For example, imagine that a district feels that its test scores are not high enough. And that is perceived by the administrator and then by the teachers. You have got, they say, says the district, to raise your test scores. And what is going on inside the brains and minds of the people who have to do it is snake, snake, snake. In other words, there are reactions in the real world, the world of education and outside it, that literally trigger the survival response in exactly the same way.
There's another researcher named Paul McLean that we really enjoy, and I think he's the most underreported or underrecognized neuroscientist. His contribution, however, is very, very important, I think. He suggests, he mostly worked with animals, but he suggests that human beings have a lot of similarities, and I think you saw that with the little tape of the mouse, that animals have some very similar reactions. So he helped us to understand more about these biological drives that tend to dominate our actions when we're in the reflexive brain or in the low road. So I'm only going to mention three, but one of them is the notion of territory. We know that animals mark their territory. Well, you notice that humans do too. We put up fences, we delineate what is ours to control, and also, ultimately, of course, wars are caused by fights over territory. So what we see is is ours, and we fight for it rather than negotiate or reason.
Let me give you an example of territoriality in schools. Teachers love their classrooms, and there's always competition for facilities. But sometimes an administrator may have a very good reason for wanting to move teachers or rearrange rooms or shift the use of facilities. Sometimes, if the atmosphere is good, that can be negotiated. When the survival response is operating, you will get a visceral reaction of my territory is being invaded, and with the best will in the world, people will be at loggerheads. So territoriality plays out in many, many ways in schools.
The second one is hierarchy. Well, it plays a very serious role in animal communities, but certainly also in human communities. And you'll know immediately. I mean, if we ask you who is in charge, who is the person at the top, who are the people in the middle, and who are the people at the bottom, you'll be able to tell that in all sorts of contexts. The thing is that under stress, we see the more powerful individuals as more important, and they actually were willing to defer to them and making decisions instead of looking at our own reasoning and keeping our own values. So the third one that I think is very interesting is camouflage. And what he says is that animals hide by melding with their surroundings. So they sort of fake their presence. And human beings, of course, do this. They lie or fake their way out of a situation. And under stress, particularly, will reach for whatever explanation is easiest instead of using evidence or reasoning.
Now think about that in a school that is trying to restructure or a school that is trying to deal with complex problems, and some people do not want to change at all. One of the classic modes of not changing is pretending to change, pretending to be in agreement. The notion of camouflage permeates any organization that is suffering from a high degree of stress.
Okay, so one more researcher we have.
And yep, and these two are fascinating because two educators called Olsen and Sexton, they looked not only at the stress on individuals, but how it impacted a school generally. They looked at an underperforming high school in Southern California, and they invented a name. They called it Hawthorne, and they came up with the concept of threat rigidity, which is a wonderful term. And what they said is that when a school experiences threat rigidity, then the entire school becomes inflexible, structures tighten, conformity is stressed, individual initiative is suppressed, and communication suffers. So the notion of threat rigidity is one well worth looking at. Incidentally, for those people who are looking for additional references, we have a free ebook. It's called Community First. You can download it directly from our website at www.canelearning.com and from the Fundestanding website. And all the references that we are giving you will be present in that ebook and in some of the other books that we've written that we will talk to you about later. So we're going to follow up with Hawthorne in a moment, but let's take a look at some of the factors that trigger stress in our work and our lives.
Okay, so too many externally imposed and uncontrollable goals. I'm sure you can relate to these very clearly. A few are okay, but when there are constant changes being presented to you, this is very stressful. Lack of control over work or work conditions. Again, you wanted one thing, things like resources aren't there. You have very little choice. Lack of empowerment, support, and resources, and we mentioned that. But that notion of empowerment is a big one. You know, a friend of ours said there is a community of compliance versus a community of empowerment. These are significant differences in how the community functions. Constant or too many imposed changes or adaptations. Again, adaptations have a great deal to do with stress. Not being heard or acknowledged. Most people can identify with that. And job insecurity and conflicting demands. I'm thinking of a workshop that Jeffrey and I did that we thought was just fantastic, but we got minimum response. We were puzzled, but at the end of the day we found that half of the people in that room were expecting to get a pink slip. So work overload and time constraints, limited access to information, and a clash between personal goals and values and the demands of the job.
So let me take you back to Hawthorne, the school that I was talking about, and I'm going to read a little bit from the report by Olsen and Sexton just to show the sorts of things that happened. We were talking about the clash between mandated goals and the values that individual teachers had. And here's something that one of the teachers said. The worst thing about it is that so many teachers are forced to focus on teaching to the test. We're not teaching literature. We're not having fun with it. We're not teaching kids to love poetry and books. I feel the hairs on the back of my neck raise when I'm doing To Kill a Mockingbird with my accelerated class. And the department chair asks me, well, what standard are you teaching to with that? I'm like, oh my God, what standard am I not covering? To Kill a Mockingbird is one of the greatest pieces of literature. They're learning about dialect. They're learning about theme. They're learning about character. They're learning about the world. Here's another quote. It deals with that problem of powerlessness and poor communication. And here talking about Hawthorne. With increasing frequency, teachers did not know the rationale behind the reforms being adopted. Let me just say that because of the pressure that Hawthorne faced, there was pressure in the media, there was pressure from parents, there was a great deal of public concern, the school board was involved, and so the administrators were really pushing hard to introduce reforms, one of which was small learning communities, and the other of which was block scheduling. But the reforms were a hash of open and closed procedures. And so let me go on with this quote. Teachers felt powerless to offer dissent or suggest alternatives. We, the researchers, also heard from the newer teachers that they believed that their jobs could be in jeopardy and that their work environment could be made more hostile if they voiced opposition to administrative decisions. For example, one of them, Layla, said, "I'm scared. I'm not going to go toe-to-toe with my department chair or principal about anything, because the next thing I know, I'm going to get my next year's schedule, and I'll be just like all those other teachers that are currently being screwed over. Teachers who have a miserable schedule, 5 different preps in 5 different rooms." So that's an example of the research.
And I just want to add that if you're interested in this part of the topic particularly, I want to sort of plug the book that where I was the lead author, and it's called Natural Learning for a Connected World, Education, Technology, of the Human Brain. And in the second part of that, we go into this in depth, and it's very interesting, I think.
So let's come to the preliminary conclusion. One of our brain-mind learning principles sums it up where we argue that complex learning is inhibited by threat associated with helplessness and or fatigue. Bottom line, too much stress, the survival response, makes it much more difficult for us to function effectively, individually and collectively. And so we've got to take action. And one of the things, the way to begin, we suggest, is by having you assess for stress. How are you going to do it? Well, on the slideshow, if you download it, and there is a free download both on our website and on Funderstanding, you can go back to the list of stresses that we describe, and what we would do is invite you individually or with colleagues to simply sit down and work through how many of them you think are operating in your school or in your organization.
So good community, from our point of view, is an antidote to stress. And sociology, psychology, and social neuroscience are now beginning to explain the biological basis of social interactions. So let's look at a couple of examples. So just in terms of the research, the brain-mind is social is another one of our principles. And close relationships have chemical links. So let's look at some of those. Pheromones. Pheromones, for example, are molecules that come off the surface of our skin, and they actually affect other people. There's a wonderful example. Pheromones deal with stress, or actually or even sexual arousal, or the need to fight. All of these kinds of emotional reactions actually are physiological as well. There's a wonderful experiment where an experimenter took a family of gerbils that were very happy and were functioning well together. They took one of the gerbils out and stressed the living daylights out of it. Then put that little gerbil back to the family, and everyone in that community experienced the stress. They all showed signs of stress. I'm going to make a big leap here, but I think that that particular kid that walks in the classroom, it's been quiet, everybody's been working. In walks this particular kid, and all of a sudden the whole classroom, reacts. So another, there's a cuddle hormone called oxytocin, which they call it the cuddle hormone because it's present whenever people like each other or they're on the same page, so to speak. And so the hormone is accelerated or is heightened when relationships are good. They're not present or minorly present when relationships are not good. So here we're also responding to our environment. By the way, this also shows between animals and human beings who love them, so that oxytocin levels in animals are raised when they're near their mentor.
So the point we're making at the moment, having dealt with stress and as an entree into the power of communities, is to begin with the notion that the brain-mind is social. We're individual human beings, but we are biologically designed to be social human beings as well. And that's the foundation for why communities are so powerful. So,
Yes.
Renata.
And I think I'm hoping that you're also seeing the relationship between the low road and the high road, that these relationships put us into the high road, and we'll make that clearer in a moment. One more thing I do want to mention, or we both want to mention, is the notion of mirror neurons. And for a long time, neuroscientists saw things, if somebody says something to you, they saw it only in terms of the words that they were speaking. But then some things happened, particularly in Italy, in Parma, in University of Parma in Italy, where they were working with monkeys, and they had the monkey wired so that they could actually see what was happening in his brain. And there was an assistant in the researcher who sat in the room and had his lunch. And suddenly the neurons fired all over the place in the brain of this monkey. And what they started to look at is just how we impact each other. So what happens is when we observe somebody or we're in relationship with someone, there are these large organizational patterns of neurons that fire together. And the closer that person is to us, the more we respect them, the stronger, more powerful is this mirroring. Because when we have this experience, we tend to mirror back what this individual says or teaches us.
So we're looking at a biological basis for imitation and mimicry and modeling. And so that's the foundation of the brain-mind is social. Now let's extend it by pointing out that everybody networks. Of course, the very fact that you are listening to this webinar is part of social networking. The number of kids who are on iPhones and who are texting with each other has proven such a problem to many schools that some of them are saying, maybe we should start using their love for connecting each other and networking and put that into the school and into the classroom. And one aspect of the fact that everyone networks is what Etienne Wenger and Jean Lave, two sociologists, called communities of practice. Their research was very interesting. They were the foundation, they provided the foundation for our deep understanding of the fact that the way people learn what to do in the job often comes from their colleagues and not just from what they're instructed to do. In this particular case, Wenger looked at clerks in an insurance company and found out that when they were filling out forms, the people that they were talking to were their fellows. And believe it or not, this sort of research formed the foundation for what are now being called communities of practice.
So healthy relationships are the foundations for individual and collective success.
So what we've done, we've gone from, and let me just go back, we've gone from the fact that the brain-mind is social to the fact, and the biological basis, to the fact that everyone networks. And now we've got something even more interesting. It is the fact that we now know that the very fact of being in good relations is intrinsically healing and healthy. There is a new field, the field of positive psychology. One of the founders is a psychologist by the name of Seligman, and he and his colleagues have shown that if people face a crisis in their life, one of the best resources for them is to have friends or colleagues who are also supporters. Here's a quote from Seligman. He says, "Other people are the best antidote to the downs of life and the single most reliable up." So good community can create feelings of well-being, and feelings of well-being
are directly related to physiology. So this is also fascinating. It was done by a team headed by Greg Ashby, but I believe it's still at UC Santa Barbara. So what they've documented is that simply feeling content and positive in our environment affects our brains and bodies and moves us into the high road. So such feelings of contentment, they've been shown to stimulate the production of the neurotransmitter dopamine, which is present when we are, in fact, feeling positive and good. Now, this, in turn, tends to stimulate the neurotransmitter acetylcholine, which, in turn, stimulates the hippocampus, the one that we met earlier, which is in charge of new learning and memory. So we're showing a direct pathway from the environment and relationships to the ability to learn. And this kind of environment has been shown to move individuals in the high road because it produces the following results, and you can see that on your screen. The benefits of feeling and well-being in an environment, in the either be it classroom or school, means this has all been researched, this has all been found. It increases working memory, creative problem solving, social interactions, including helpfulness and sociability, so people are nicer to each other. Decision making, they're able to make better decisions, and in a future webinar we hope to focus on decision making and its relationship to stress. It also affected flexibility in thinking. They were able to see more options, and it improved verbal fluency in adolescence. So those are the benefits that we see in terms of academic performance for creating a good community.
So we're now halfway through. We've looked at two issues. We've looked at the problems generated by stress, and we've looked at the fact that being in good community just in and of itself can help people feel better, work more effectively, and solve their problems more effectively. So the question is, what do we do? How do we make it work? And we're looking at the art of building a good learning community. Incidentally, the book that came out by Renata and I in October of last year by ASCD is called Strengthening and Enriching Your Professional Learning Community, The Art of Learning Together. And that book goes in a great deal of depth into some of the topics that we're going to be talking about right now. We're going to be looking at two specific issues. One is to develop a field of listening. That is, people need to be heard. They love feeling heard. The way to deal with problems in a community is to make sure that there is a capacity to listen.
And also, the other one is understanding individual differences, because different styles not only listen differently, but they respond to stress differently. And this is another field that we may go into in depth in future webinars, but for the time being, we're going to cover this at the moment.
So let's take a look at the issue of listening. And I'm going to do this with a preliminary question to you to think about how you and your colleagues in your school or your place of work listen. What sort of field of listening do you think that you have, and what sort of field of listening would you like to have? Just take a moment, and you might want to ponder that as we go through this part of the webinar. Our approach to listening has been to see it in terms of occurring in layers. And the first layer is cocktail party listening. There's a way in which people behave in cocktail parties, and of course cocktail parties can be great fun. Social listening is wonderful, but when that type of listening, and we call it surface listening, occurs in a meeting or occurs between colleagues who are trying to resolve problems, then it is inappropriate. And what I'd like to do now is simply to provide you with a list of indicators, a list of questions that illustrate surface listening. If we're talking about people out there, to what extent do you think they assume that they know what a speaker is going to say before the speaker has finished speaking? To what extent do they jump in with an opinion before a person has finished speaking. To what extent is the conversation, maybe in a meeting or when you're dealing with an issue, to what extent is that conversation have absolutely no pauses, no times to think? To what extent is it sometimes assumed that somebody has nothing to contribute? They may just be always quiet, or they may not be a member of the in-group.
And I just want to add that these levels of listening have real and direct implications for how we deal with our students.
Oh yes, so at the moment we're talking about adults within a school, but this is exactly applicable to the way the teachers are and the kids are in classrooms. Let me add just a couple more indicators. To what extent do you think people speak without paying attention to what others in the group are actually interested in, or talk across each other, or automatically nod their heads in agreement without actually having paid much attention at all? All of these are indicators of surface listening, and you want to get more than that when you are working with problem solving with members of staff. So that takes us to the next layer, which is something that many of you would be familiar with, and that's active listening. And so let me invite you to bring to mind a time when you had an issue that you had to deal with, and you went to a friend, and that person paid absolutely full attention. They asked good questions. They simply wanted to understand. When that happens, that person is helping you to understand and the issue is becoming clear. And in that context, what you're looking at is an intentional type of listening that is slower and more courteous than surface listening. It occurs when we listen for the purpose of understanding or genuinely trying to help each other.
I want to just add something here, because I was at a fairly high-level conference with neuroscientists, and one of the neuroscientists was explaining the optimum environment for learning and listening. It had to do with listening and how you listen. And there were educators all in that room who were puzzled, who were entranced by what she was saying. And when I looked around and I said, basically, isn't this what we call active listening in education? Everyone perked up. Oh yes, they couldn't see the connection between the neuroscience, the physiology of listening, and the actual behavior. But think about how often we use active listening in education. We know the word, but we don't necessarily use it.
And now let me describe the sort of climate that happens when you're listening in that way. You'll find that there is an emphasis on questions rather than on statements. There will be pauses in the conversation, and there tends to be more of a give and take. And that is what you're looking for when you're collectively working to solve complex problems. Now, there's a third layer, and I'm only going to mention it briefly. We call it deep listening. There's a particular type of experience that people can have when they're in this mode together. And that is, you know that you are being heard, you feel heard, and you are hearing others. And here's the important point. You're not competing for time to talk. If you don't feel a need to compete for time, if you don't feel a need to defend yourself, if you feel that you are free to express an opinion and it will be acknowledged, not necessarily agreed with. People can have strong disagreements, but your opinion and your difference of opinion will be heard. Then you're creating the atmosphere in which rigorous thinking can lead to really good, hard, realistic decisions.
And I would like to add something, because education, or educators, we are so deeply committed to right and wrong answers. And when we listen to each other non-judgmentally, we listen for the information, for the actual meaning of what that person is saying. We really have to suspend our judgment for a bit. We can always express our beliefs and our opinions, but we have to allow the other person that space, and that's what Jeffrey is talking about.
Now, it's all very well and good to say we're going to do this. The question is how. there are some very powerful strategies out there. If you get the ebook, the free ebook that we've been talking about, we mentioned some of them. Our particular favorite strategy is called an ordered sharing, which is essentially a repeated process that helps people experience what it is like to share without being interrupted and to listen to others non-judgmentally. I'm not going to describe the process in detail, but in the ebook you will find a URL, you will find information on our website, and you will find information in the ASCD book that I mentioned a little bit earlier. So, we've just had a question from actually a friend of ours, Carl Klimek. Carl, the question is, are you aware of any schools in the US or elsewhere that are intentionally building in professional development opportunities that address stress and the impact on teaching and learning? And if so, what does that professional development look like? And what I'm going to refer you to, Carl, is an Australian program called Learning to Learn. We were colleagues with it for 10 years, and the philosophy that was developed there, finally implemented by the entire state of South Australia. And sometimes they don't deal with stress overtly, but they had a fabulous approach to learning circles in which twice every semester the lead teachers and the staff got together and dealt with the issues that were bothering them in a very, very well facilitated way. And what I'll do is we'll put online, and I'll also communicate privately, some of the information about Learning to Learn. But that is the best approach that I've ever heard of.
I've also blogged on Funderstanding, so I think my blog is showing up next week if you want to look for it. And it mentions Learning to Learn and also the website for South Australia Department of Education. The question is a good one, and I want to just say, do we know a school in the U.S. that emphasizes this? Not to our knowledge. Isn't that sad? I haven't even thought about that. We hadn't thought about that. Not really. You may know a school, and you could certainly forward that to us. But we see this as essential because we think that the difference between Australia and America was in Australia people had these kinds of relationships. In South Australia, in the schools we worked with, they had these kinds of relationships. And as a matter of fact, they've had to volunteer to be a part of Learning to Learn. And part of the criterion for being able to join was this kind of community. And it was a total community of empowerment, not only for the teachers, the staff, the principal, but for the students as well. And we actually write about that in Natural Learning for a Connected World.
So let's take a look at the action steps that follow what we've been talking about in terms of the field of learning. The field of listening, I suppose it's a field of learning as well. Number one, work to assess your field of listening. Think about the three layers of listening that we've been talking about. Think about the parameters, the criteria for surface, active, and deep listening, and have a discussion, you and your staff, and we strongly recommend that this not be a top-down discussion. Collectively, think about and talk about the field of listening that you have in your organization. And then secondly, we'd strongly recommend that you intentionally implement processes that develop the field of listening. We use what we call the ordered sharing. There's a process out there called the use of a talking stick. In our book, Community First, we refer you to 3 different wonderful books and URLs on the art of listening. And this is where we think would be a very, very good place to go. So let's move on to the second topic we want to talk about, which is understanding individual differences.
Okay. So probably want to add something more, though, on the field of how important the community is and the relationships are. Because a colleague of us said basically that what we now have are communities of compliance. And I think this shouldn't be underemphasized. When we talk about, communities in schools, communities of compliance means that everybody is pretty much looking to fulfill somebody else's expectations or goals or edicts. And what we were looking at in Australia was simply the communities of empowerment, where everybody was empowering everyone. And I do believe that that's an American message, quite frankly, because America's always been known for its creativity. But when you conform, you lose creativity. Conformity actually, remember, leads into the low road. So in an effort to improve induced conformity leads into the low road. And so in an effort to raise standards, make our kids more intelligent, we've actually created the conditions that don't do that.
And that is rather sad. And so to individual differences.
Right. Now, in your communities, it's really important to begin to identify people's styles of the way that they communicate. And in essence, well, in a way, the essence that they are. And because these styles react to stress differently, again. But let's look at them in the beginning.
Just as a prelude, Renato and I have had a fair amount of experience looking at individual styles, and there are many instruments out there. So what we did literally a couple of decades ago is to begin to synthesize information from many of these different instruments. We pulled them together into the 4 styles that you see here. Renato did the validation in a study with educators. So whilst we've updated them, this is our approach. You can find more about the styles, incidentally, on our website, www.canelearning.com. Anyway,
and you can actually download the instrument yourself and take the test and figure out which one of these different styles is yours. One more thing before we go into the styles is that you are a configuration of styles. So everyone has all the different styles. But there tends to be one style that dominates for you. And understanding that style can be extremely helpful. So we're looking at directors. And directors are natural leaders. They tend to see the big picture. They tend to get things done.
They do push ahead.
Yeah, they do push ahead, and they expect other people to do the work. So they're quite wonderful for a project or anything else, and most of the time they are the people that make things happen. But at the same time, when they're stressed, they can become very pushy and very curt, so that they get down to brass tacks, do this, this is what I need, this is what. So they lose sight of relationship, can lose sight of relationship.
And they can lose sight of details. So they'll just give you one deadline or one goal after another without unpacking it. And for some of us who are not natural directors, that is frustrating.
And this is where our own styles are going to come to the fore, because I am sort of a director. And I'm a very wonderful, sweet person most of the time. But when things get, push comes to shove, I've been known to just become very direct and what some might say less personal. Okay, that's the first style. The second style is the style of the nurturer. So these are the natural supporters, and they care most about feelings. By the way, the director cares a lot about words, what you say. The nurturer cares about feelings, other people's feelings, their own feelings, and most of the time they are wonderful because they support others. And in a way, they support directors. So they often are the best secretaries, best assistants, they are the people who take care of the details and take care of the people.
They can be fabulous teachers and administrators, because for them relationship is very important, and right at the heart of good communication is good relationship.
Right. At the same time, and here I'm coming in as the director, they often value emotions over academic performance and academic empowerment. So, if something makes you uncomfortable or unhappy or so forth, they have been known to say, well, don't worry about that, because they don't want you to be stressed. They don't want you to be hurt. But in the long run, that may not be the best solution. And when these individuals, the nurturers, are stressed, they become overly needy.
So they begin to crave more relationship, which means they can crowd you, they can get closer to you, they can want more time. And so suddenly directors and nurturers may be at loggerheads in stressful situations.
Right. And it makes me think of something, which is that you actually, these styles are not, you know, cut in, what do you say, they're not based in fact all the time. They're not like based on rocks. They're not, so
they are based in fact, but they're not solidly
yeah.
cemented in rock.
I don't know. Words are failing me right now. But the point is, at one point, I was more of a nurturer. And I've become a director because of my environment, my work environment, and what I need to do these days. So I can remember being more of a nurturer. So anyway, they do shift a little bit. Evaluators, they are the natural organizers. They have a plan. They stay on top of the plan. They are critical about timelines, how long something takes. They want you to adhere to whatever you plan.
I'm going to put this in a fairly positive light on the grounds that I'm an evaluator. So we love systems, we love order, we love checking and rechecking details. We want to follow the instructions when we pull something out of pull a product out of a box. We want to do things, in quotes, the right way.
Okay. Well, I'm going to go to the adventurer next because well, this is, oh sorry, when the perfectionist becomes,
when the evaluator becomes,
yeah, sorry, when the evaluator, now we're getting personally involved, you see, but when the evaluator becomes stressed, they become perfectionists.
Then we become picky and perfectionists and a pain in the butt.
Yes, so let's leave it at that. And then the last type is the adventurer, and these are natural explorers, but they're also the ideas person, the creative person. Someone called them the prophets in terms that they see ahead. So they see the big picture, and you know, they can see the massive connections and how things should function. They are not always the best keeper of rules, because rules are sort of meant to be dealt with in a more creative way, and other people don't see that. They can become very unfocused when stressed, and they can see too many possibilities, start many projects but not finish them. So I want to tell a story here about when Jeffrey and I were first married, very early in our marriage. We decided to take a day off and enjoy ourselves. And so we made a plan for the day and decided what we were going to be doing. And of course, being the adventurer, we were out there and I said, oh, Jeffrey, I know we planned to go to this restaurant. Let's go to this restaurant instead. It looks really great. So he went with me. And another thing was, we were walking along and we were saying, oh, you know, there's a nursery. We could get some plants for our house, you know. So he went with me. Anyway, at the end of the day, I said, wasn't that a fabulous day? That was one of the best days. And he looked at me and he said, that was one of the worst days I've ever had. We didn't do anything what we planned to do. So these are real fundamental differences, because the evaluator has pleasure out of fulfilling what they plan. That's really far-fetched for an adventurer who really is satisfied by lots of variety and acting in the moment.
Let's take a look at how this plays out in a school or an organization or an environment. On the one hand, and we had a wonderful school that we worked with called Mountain View, where we implemented our profile for the first time in the early 1990s. And they identified their individual differences, and they demonstrated that these 4 different styles are absolutely superb in building a good community. There are people who have drive and to push and want to make things happen. There are people who are very sympathetic and who want to make sure that others are involved and build relationship. There are people, the evaluators, who want to make sure that protocols are followed and that the procedures that, say, are involved in professional development are implemented. And the adventurers are fabulous because they don't take things that seriously, and so they can create a mode of play and joy.
And flexibility.
And flexibility. When these people become stressed, so that school Mountain View that we worked with did many of the things that we regard as really important. their principal made sure that they had worked for several months together on thinking through what they wanted to do because they knew they needed to improve. They identified the sorts of materials, and in fact it was one of them who came across our book, who led to us being invited to work with them. They formed process learning circles, which is our way of working. Those circles were facilitated by very good facilitators. They took a STARS instrument and began to work on themselves, and at the same time they engaged in very, very rigorous deep thinking about a theory of learning and about how to become more effective as teachers. And so the result is there were all sorts of wonderful things that happened with that school, both test score-based and otherwise. There was an increase in attendance rate. There was an increase in attendance rates. There were reduced problems of discipline. There was greater interaction and courtesy between the teaching and the non-teaching staff. There was much more parental involvement. And in terms of academic results, the school became a California Blue Ribbon school. So the bottom line is the material that we're talking to you about is very, very potent in helping you to deal with that issue of stress and creating a good environment in your school.
And I hope at this point you're also seeing again that we are trying to create the high road which allows students to learn better.
So in terms of the action you might take when you're looking at individual differences, you could take the profile that you can find on our website at canelearning.com. We would strongly recommend you begin to look at how the stars play themselves out in your communications and interactions at work. And then, when times are tough, when there is pressure from above and when you need to achieve results, take a look at how people react to stress differently. Because the more you can honor their differences, the more you can actually deal with stress in the environment.
And only a brief note, when we expect other people to be like us, that leads to stress, and it also leads to conflict.
So now we're just about in the wrap-up mode. We'd like to review what we have done and to point you in the direction of where you can go to get more information in the future. Our primary theme was that stress is a hidden saboteur. That stress in and of itself makes it more difficult for us to function effectively, irrespective of what we're trying to do, and that many of the programs and innovations that are introduced by people with the best will in the world can actually induce the survival response, and therefore we end up shooting ourselves in the foot. And we have suggested that one of the best ways of dealing with this is to build a good community. That good learning community and a good community or in a school or district is an antidote in and of itself to some of the problems induced by stress.
Okay, and then we described the research, which is really the foundation, the physiological foundation for what we're advocating. And basically that stress, threat, helplessness, many of the factors that are working in schools now in an effort to create better learning, in fact, sabotage that process.
Very briefly, we've mentioned two stories. We mentioned Hawthorne, which is a real school with a fake name, and we mentioned Mountain View, which is a real school with a fake name. And we compared stories about what worked and what didn't. And there's a key message there, which is that many innovations, such as professional learning communities or even style instruments, when implemented the right way, are very potent, but when they're introduced the wrong way, they get in the way. We identified the steps developing a field of listening and working with individual styles, and now, because we're just about coming to a close, we want to point out that you can get more information and free downloads both from us on our website at www.canelearning.com, and there is a huge amount of wonderful information on funderstanding.com. I should add that Renata's blog, the newest blog, will be up on Friday. You can find out about our books and more materials on our website. And with that, I think we want to thank Eric and thank Understanding and thank everybody out there.
Thank you very much, and it's lovely to to be with you. We hope to be with you again in the future.
And we wish you all the best.
And happy holidays.